All right, so we are all celebrating. Cheers to our recorded podcast being successfully recorded. And so now we're going to just transition and answer some of these questions. So I'm going to may ask the first one from the group. As a group, what are your 3 most significant takeaways from having done this project? Do you want to go around and everybody just say one takeaway?
Sure. I think the biggest takeaway for me was gaining a larger understanding of peer support outside of the substance use realm. Peer support has always, to me, in my jobs, been in regards to substance use. And so hearing from the experts on how this can be implemented in different areas was really eye-opening. And I'm glad that we got this opportunity, because I think if we hadn't chosen this subject and we hadn't had these particular experts, that may be something I was still lacking information in.
I would say working collaboratively with everyone, getting to see the different approaches to peer support. As you mentioned, Melissa, that was definitely different to hear from Dr. Anna Newcomb, where she spoke about peers from a trauma-based perspective. So I think that was definitely different and interesting to me.
Yeah, I think for me, just hearing, reading the literature and then hearing from everyone, it's the experience of peer support professionals is very similar across the board, right? And it doesn't matter if it's addiction or if it's trauma or if it's mental illness, with, not speaking of trauma necessarily, there's just such commonalities, right? The stigma. And I thought it was pretty cool that each of the experts actually were essentially saying the same thing from 2 different, perspectives, and I think that, the literature spoke to that as well. So there is information out there that says this is how we can do it better. So now it's time, for us and anyone that would listen to something like that to be able to pick up that ball and, and just do it differently,
Yeah.
So I'll stop there. I could probably talk on that for an hour, but.
I think my biggest takeaway was from Leah Litchfield when she talked about safety and how, as we're looking at these programs, or like Kevin mentioned, as we're looking to improve existing programs, that's a huge factor, is safety. And if we're employing or people are volunteering as peers, their safety is really important, especially given all that they've already been through. And so now they're really giving back and paying it forward. And how can we best protect them in that endeavor? I think that was my biggest takeaway. Great questions. And so here's our next question. As a group, what data sources, possibly literature, research, content experts, colleagues, most changed or influenced your thinking about your chosen topic?
I think there's always a benefit. Oh, sorry, Kevin.
No, Melissa, you go ahead.
I think there's always a benefit in hearing it straight from people's mouths who have those lived experiences, because we can read literature all day, and it's not necessarily going to reflect specifically what those lived experiences actually look like. I will say, though, one benefit that I did find from the actual literature was I was really surprised to see how much stigma still exists in organizations headed by social workers and social workers' perspectives of peers. When we are in this field where we focus on being non-judgmental, and just really seeing that the literature shows that there's still really a long way to go before, even as social workers, we have completely ridded ourselves of that stigma, especially around substance use. And so, and we heard that a little bit with our experts too, just that continuing stigma that exists. And so I think hearing from that perspective and from the literature really just solidified that point, that there really is a long way to go, even in us humble social workers who, pride ourselves on, not being judgmental against people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that as well. The literature that talked about stigma, right, and microaggressions, and I thought was really powerful, because while you see it, I don't necessarily always think about what would a client think, right? And realistically, sometimes when you're employing peer support professionals, You have people that were clients in the room, right? And people that, that come into treatment, right? And they don't know what they're going to do with their lives, if they were to get clean, right? They can't quite figure out, okay, so I'm going to stop using drugs and then what? Right. And then if that and then what becomes, you're going to be a part of a clinical team. And then you hear the way in which people talk about the clients when they're part of that clinical team, it can be pretty demoralizing. Right. Yeah. And so I think just, keeping that in mind to Melissa's point about making sure that, even as, as social workers, we can get drawn into those conversations. I think that all of us can do a really good job of, or a better job maybe, of just not making it an us and them type of situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To piggyback both off of Melissa and Kevin, what I did here today with the experts is that they're not perfect, and that they are definitely learning every day. And it's not a perfect world, especially from the social worker. She mentioned something that she experienced when she kind of made a mistake and she was corrected. So I think that's the number one takeaway here is that, we're learning from our mistakes and we're moving forward because, discrimination and marginalization do occur even unintendedly. Like sometimes you don't even think about it, and sometimes you're perpetuating the same systems that you're there to disabolish. So I think that just having that in the forefront of your mind, that is the number one takeaway that I took away today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would add to this too, and this was a point of learning for me. I'm familiar with trauma peers, but I'm not as familiar with peers with substance use. And so I love reading the literature and hearing you all share about it. And I didn't realize the stakes were so high in terms of peers with substance use, that if they possibly relapse, that they're out of a position, they are out of a paycheck, it's cut. And that added level of pressure, in addition to being on a team and hearing maybe a multidisciplinary team talk about people who relapse or talk about people who have not yet, been successful in their recovery, that I think would just add to the stigma, right? And possibly they're struggling with that relapse or have relapsed and afraid that someone's going to find out now. That's just a whole nother level of pressure that I'm curious that working in those systems that could be further looked at, you know what I mean? On behalf of peers. So here's another question. As a group, what were some of the challenges you faced as a community of learners engaged in a complex task? So this is actually a process question for us as learners. What were some of our challenges that we faced engaged in this complex task of this project?
I think one of the possible challenges could have been, not enough time, to outside of the classroom. And I know I'm kind of taking the easy way out on this question because the instructor giving us 20 to 30 minutes almost each time we met mitigated that problem, right? We didn't have that issue. Well, one, I think because, and this will kind of broach the next question on signature strengths, right? But we had the opportunity to meet, figure out what did we want to do? How are we going to do it? Let's come together next time with enough information so we can actually take that and carry that and run with it. I think that, just all being in different places and, Melissa being in a different time zone, right? Like that's, there needs to be a little bit of flexibility. And I think as a group, we did pretty well, with that flexibility and, took it seriously and, used social learning and said, well, if everybody else is going to do it, I better not come empty handed. And I think that goes a long way.
Kevin, you stole my answer.
I figure if I keep talking, I'll take like 3.
I'm going to mute myself. Go ahead.
No, I agree though, Kevin. I think that there's always challenges that come with doing group projects in general. And there's just that added difficulty when you're doing anything virtually, right? It just creates that added issue. And yes, we were working on this in our own time, but just making sure we were coordinating, keeping everybody up to date. And Kevin, I thank you because I think you did a really great job of making sure that our outline stayed up to date and that everybody was adding. And Eileen, thank you so much for keeping us on task with that and making sure that everyone knew what part they were doing. And I think that really made a huge difference, because I have definitely done group projects in person with people that have not gone as smoothly as this one did, with, like you said, Kevin, different time zones, different schedules, different lives, right? That we all keep living when we're outside of that 30 minutes that we get in the classroom. And just, I think that the organization and the just great teamwork that we had really made a huge difference on how smoothly this whole thing went for me.
Mhm. And I think, as I spoke before about the passion, I think the passion is what drove us, to creating this and to making sure that this runs smoothly, because we all seem passionate about this work. So that helped.
Mm. I'm going to agree with you on that, Leah, because, well, Kevin and Leah, you both mentioned like our professor as a learner, responding to the professor putting some of these things in place in our syllabus, like having that extra time in class really helped. And having, for each of us, we all kind of got to choose the topic based off of our interests. And Leah, I know you mentioned like we're passionate about this, and we kind of are like, and each one of us, there's something about this. So we've already been part of this before this class. And so we're able to bring a sense of ourself and a sense of our purpose into this project. So win-win. Any other thoughts on that before we go to the next one? Good. Okay. As a group, what are your signature strengths and how are these reflected in your podcast? What are your signature strengths and how is it reflected in the podcast?
Well, I think, as Leah said, I think as a group, we have a signature strength of passion about the topic. If you go into, I think we go back to that learning about curiosity, right? When we talked a little earlier in the semester and how curiosity can help fuel interest in learning. And so this is something that we've all got some experience in, but also had a lot of knowledge that was still lacking in different areas. And so I think that curiosity that we all brought to the table helped us to come together to find information that would help support peer workers and the peer idea in general. So I would say that I think as a group overall, just the passion of the subject and that curiosity was definitely a strength.
I would say efficiency too. I think I lucked out in being in this group. I think all of you are extremely efficient with your time and your, I think having that shared Google Doc was super nice because I'm a late bird, so I was doing stuff late at night, but somebody else might be doing something in the morning. And it having that shared document, I think everyone's efficiency is really high in this group. So I really appreciate you for that. Any other thoughts on that question? No? Okay.
I agree with all.
Yeah, me too. I don't have anything to add. I agree.
Okay, 2 questions left. So as you think about podcasting as both a source of evidence and teaching, in your group's opinion, for what audience would your podcast be most suited for and why? So what audience do you feel like this podcast is most suited for and why?
I think that, because is anyone else in the interdisciplinary class right now? Okay, so that class is about interdisciplinary teams, and that's essentially what we talk about from week 1 to week 14. Well, so far week 7, but I think that interdisciplinary teams need some education on what peer support specialists can bring to the table. And it was reflected in some of the research, and it was also reflected by both of our experts in just, the important role that someone who can actually connect with the client, because oftentimes as social workers, we bring in that advocacy piece, but the peer support specialist who's actually navigating that life and this, successfully navigating that life can really take it a step further. So I think that, this particular subject matter would go a really long way in helping to bridge the gaps between a doctor, a nurse, a vocational rehab specialist, right? Whomever else might be on the team that doesn't necessarily understand or appreciate the value that a peer can have on the team.
Well, and I think as well, it would be beneficial or could be beneficial to any organization that's waffling with the idea of implementing peers, right?
Mhm.
I think it's a good way to understand, not just from the literature, but from lived experiences, what the benefits of having peers within the organization are. Because I remember when we first started implementing peers at the mental health clinic that I worked at, nobody knew what it was, why we were doing it, or what the benefit was. And I think that if we'd had something like this podcast to begin with to better understand not just what it is, but the benefits that having a peer there can be, and also the experience of someone who's gone through recovery and maybe had her own interaction with Leah, having her own interaction maybe with peers who helped her through that and not feeling alone. I think that that could be a huge benefit to maybe making that decision of, do we implement peer services or do we not implement peer services, and having that stronger understanding that if they did implement it, it could be implemented more successfully with less questions.
Mhm. I agree with you, Melissa. I also think that it can be psychoeducational, where you can bring this information to the actual peers. I believe you mentioned that because when you think about it, sometimes they're on the edge and they're thinking, is this person like me? Is this going to be just like any other, clinician that I meet with? So just to have this information to build that rapport, I think will be beneficial.
Mhm. And I would add education as well. I mean, I think any social work, bachelor's, master's, or doctoral level social work courses, as well as others, could really benefit if in teaching, say in teaching social learning, social cognitive theory, in teaching social cognitive theory, and teaching some of these other theories, and then putting this podcast in with it to really flesh it out, so it leaves the theory and it's actually application in the real world. I think students could really benefit from that. Great. Any other thoughts? Last question. All right, drum roll. What is something else about your group that you would like to reflect on? Is there anything else about our group that we would like to reflect on?
I think we've covered it pretty clearly, but I just want to just reflect on the great teamwork and the passion and just the welcoming attitude. I think that when you work in a group, you can feel like an outcast, or you feel like your opinion isn't quite as valued. And throughout this whole process, I felt like everybody had amazing input. Everybody's opinions were respected. Everybody was cared about throughout the whole process. And I think that just honestly, from my personal opinion, working with you guys has been an absolute pleasure, and probably the smoothest group project I have ever accomplished in my academic career. So I just want to say thank you again.
I would second that.
Me too. You said it perfectly.
All right, well, that's that. Yes.
That's a wrap.
Perfect.